If you've been online in the last few months, chances are you've seen this map posted somewhere. And if you have seen this map, I assume you've also read the comments, which are more likely than not to have been something about, oh, there they are again, East Germans nostalgic for dictatorship, or, oh, looks like the Soviet Union and communism was just as bad as the Nazis and the like. So is it as simple as that? Well, no. But to properly explain this one image, we'll have to talk about the last 30-ish years of German history. And now I want to get one thing out of the way first. I am not defending the Soviet Union's denazification of East Germany. I will say that the denazification of East Germany was much more thorough than that of West Germany, and to even compare them is a joke. But being better than West Germany in that aspect is a pretty low bar to clear. If anything, the Soviet Union should have been much, much harsher on former Nazis and its supporters. But as you'll soon see, the question of why East Germany votes far right is a much more complicated topic than something that can be explained away in one sentence. In 1990, it was election time in both East and West Germany, and Helmut Kohl of the West German CDU party was having a bit of trouble. He had already been in power for the last 8 years, and people were getting tired of him. But Kohl wasn't quite ready to give up his seat as chancellor, so he came up with a campaign that would secure him another win, something that was on everybody's minds: unifying the two Germanys as fast as possible. Now, the East and West were still two separate countries at this point and had agreed that they would not interfere with each other's elections. This agreement was, of course, ignored. What followed in the next 12 months was a flood of West German information and interference in East German elections. In a matter of days, more than 300 West German newspapers, magazines, radio, and television programs began to flood the market, each of them telling the people of the East how authoritarian their government is and that their economy was about to collapse. In fact, political parties within West Germany created newspapers for East Germans to tell them how bad their lives were, encouraging them to vote for the Allianz für Deutschland coalition, which promised, just like Helmut Kohl wanted, a quick reunification. West German parties like the CDU and SPD spent more than 7 million Deutsche Marks on campaigns to influence the East German elections. West German politicians across the spectrum, from smaller local politicians to Helmut Kohl himself, came to the East and campaigned for the Allianz für Deutschland. And to give you an idea of how fast the influence of the West crept into East Germany, Helmut Kohl had tried to give speeches in the East the previous year right after the fall of the wall, only to be booed into leaving. The West had a sort of white man's burden, if you will, to educate and raise the East Germans to their standards. This mentality is part of the reason why the interference in East Germany's elections is so well documented and so open that nobody really bothers to deny it. Internal West German reports boasted about West German politicians gaining influence over the East, so much so that members of West German parties became uncomfortable with the extent of political interference. Egon Bahr of the SPD would complain that the entire GDR election became a campaign controlled by the West German CDU. Children were paid to hand out Allianz für Deutschland leaflets. Cars with West German license plates would drive through the streets with loudspeakers telling people to boycott other East German parties, and in some instances, members of the East German government were assaulted and threatened with violence while campaigning. Egon concluded, "That was pure psychological terror in a Goebbels mold. I wish to reiterate that this political dirt was imported from the Federal Republic." This was dubbed in the press as the first free elections in East Germany, which is quite funny, honestly. It's a big part of the national myth Germans tell themselves. As soon as the West gave them free elections, they voted to destroy their own country. But who was the election free for, freedom for West German parties to interfere because the Easterners couldn't be trusted to make their own decisions? If you look up free East German elections, you'll be directed to this Wikipedia page that proudly states that these were the first free elections in the region since 1932. I wonder what the Germans of 1932 did with all that freedom. It should come as no surprise that the CDU and Allianz für Deutschland coalition would win the election. Before moving on to all the freedom the West was about to impose on the East, it's important to talk about what people from the East actually wanted. During the election of the 90s, it was a popular idea to create a sort of union of two states that were united. both still with their own respective economic systems. Numerous polls taken during election time revealed that more than 70% of East Germans had wanted to keep a more reformed type of socialist system. To put it simply, they had wanted to maintain some of their living standards and work privileges, and also the shiny new things the West had to offer. With the Allianz für Deutschland coalition in charge, though, the unification would begin to look more like an annexation. Instead of two states coming together to form one would be taking advantage of and plundering the other. First came the currency union, which had started even before formal unification. In East Germany, Germans had less money, but at the same time, the cost of goods like food, clothing, entertainment, like books and theater tickets, even rent, was much lower, meaning even with the less money, they could still afford to live. Then came the currency union, which pegged the East and West German mark at 1-to-1. Suddenly, with a market now flooded by West German goods and money, the prices of everything began to rise. A group of American researchers studying the effect of this crash deemed it one of the worst and sharpest depressions in European history. Since inflation also really hurts exports and the East German economy relied strongly on exports, more than 30% of the economy collapsed overnight. Karl Schachschneider, a professor of civil law, described the currency union as a crass injustice and represented a serious infraction of basic economic legality. During an investigative committee, Rainer Golke, the former boss of the Treuhand, would say, a country could cope with a reevaluation of perhaps 4 to 5% by increasing production, but anything above that would mean bankruptcy. The East German currency had undergone a reevaluation of about 400%. Then came privatization. Originally, the Treuhand was set up to make sure that no one was taking advantage of all the new companies that could be bought up, and to protect the publicly owned property and industry. But with the new government in charge, and Helmut Kohl pushing for a speedy unification in order to ensure a re-election, the emphasis was put on speed. So much so that when the first boss of the Treuhand, the Rainer Golke guy we quoted earlier, wasn't doing it fast enough, he was fired and replaced by Detlev Rohwedder. And Detlev got to work immediately. Shipyards, farms, factories, mines, industry, everything was getting privatized and sold off as fast as possible. In what seemed like overnight, jobs in industry fell by more than 75%. Profitable companies like Grete and Regelwerke Teltow, worth 170 million marks, were sold off to West Germans for a single mark and stripped for parts. West German airports paid newspapers to spread the news that the East Germans hadn't properly trained their airplane mechanics and it wouldn't be safe to fly with them, ignoring that the East German company Interflug had one of the highest safety ratings in all of Europe. East Germans were deemed to be incompetent in managerial positions and replaced by more competent West German ones. Companies went from 20,000 employees to 2,000, from 5,500 to 630. By the end of privatization, almost half of East Germans were living in economically precarious circumstances. The unemployment rate went from virtually 0 to 40%, and the Treuhand, led by West Germany, had divided up publicly owned property as quickly as possible. In the end, 80% of the GDR's property had been sold to West Germans, 10% to other Europeans, and only 5% remained in the hands of the people who lived there. What was valued to be around 650 billion marks in 1989 had come to cost them a 260 billion debt a few years later. Detlev Rohwedder and the Treuhand were hated in East Germany, and they were rightfully blamed for causing an economic depression. It got to the point that Detlev was assassinated in his home with a rifle. A report from the Treuhand's successor, the BVS, reads, at the very latest, with the fall of the wall on 9th of November 1989, there began not only a rapid process of reunification of both German states, but also a collapse of the state authority of the GDR, making possible a very particular form of economic criminality, a so-called unification criminality representing a not very glorious chapter in the German unification process. Then came the West German bank fees. Because of privatization, West German banks were able to buy East German ones. But East German banks worked differently than those of the West. In the East, the banks gave money to companies for maintenance costs, investments, and other state and company functions. This was given from the bank not as a loan, but as state support given back to the people because company profits would typically be sent back to the state. But the West Germans didn't care much about how the East was run, so every time a bank had given money to an association to build new houses or to a company for general maintenance costs, this was counted as a loan, despite neither the association or company ever asking for it, meaning that East German debts to banks went from 0 to 180 billion virtually overnight. Now, the East German banks made an agreement that the interest rate wouldn't go higher than 0.5%, but the West Germans were sneaky. They waited until the East German banks had disappeared completely, and once no one could do anything about it, the interest rate was raised to 10%. Companies were unable to continue running with such massive debts. Even tenants of buildings built by the state were hit with massive debts for money that they never personally had anything to do with. And then came the process of decommunization. Unlike the denazification of 40 years prior, the Federal Republic of Germany decided this time they would take it very seriously. And if you would like to learn more about the failures of denazification, I have another video all about that. Researchers, academics, and intellectuals would be purged from the Federal Republic's new social order. Not only were academies focused on history and political science closed, but also ones relating to mathematics, medicine, and art. The Federal Republic alleged that the GDR had a lower academic standard and implemented a vetting process that would allow former employees of GDR institutions to keep their job. The vetting process consisted of political questionnaires to root out any hints of communist sympathies. Because of this, 50% of the East German workforce that had a university degree had been laid off, meaning after unification, East Germany had the highest rate of unemployment for university graduates, not only in Europe, but the world. New television, radio, and newspapers were created in the unified East, which employed West Germans almost exclusively. This segregation extends into politics as well. Since reunification, only 11 of 135 civil service department heads are from East Germany, and only 17 of the ministers in the federal government have been from East Germany. In the current government, only 2 of the 17 minister positions are occupied by East Germans. The schools would not remain untouched either. In some German states, such as Thuringia, as many as 1 in 9 teachers were fired. By the end of unification, 75,000 teachers had not just been fired, but completely blacklisted. In addition, the East German education system had to be corrected by the West Germans. People like to point at the East German education system and claim that it was nothing but indoctrination. But this is ignoring the fact that every country in the world raises its kids with the values, ideas, and political beliefs that they want them to have. A case in point, the new West German curriculum that took over schools in the East began to teach children how awesome the free market is. A new school curriculum lists class topics for kids as young as 13, like the functions of a market economy, free elections as a feature of democratic government, and economic and consumption trends. As time has passed, things have stayed more or less the same, where today East Germany is taught as a foreign dictatorship that was imposed on Germans that would eventually be made better by absorbing them into the West. And of course, in a political climate where only 30 years prior, race mixing was deemed to be communism, and where 30 years later, politicians like Joe Biden and Hitler are accused of being communists, the status of women was also called into question. In the GDR, 88% of adult women were part of the workforce. 20 years later, 70% of those unemployed in the East are women. In addition, public daycares and support for women with children was also done away with, making having a job and a child virtually impossible for the 68% of working women in the GDR. Abortion, which was not only legal but also completely free, was protested against so heavily by the ruling party, the CDU, that only 3 years after unification it was made illegal and remains so to this day, with a few exceptions and mandatory counseling that must be done first. Then, the unified Germany decided to give former owners of East German land the right to claim and evict those who currently lived and had lived there for the last 40 years. This right wasn't just given to those who had owned the land, however, but extended onto distant relatives of the owners, including people who had never even lived in Germany. 2.2 million claims were filed to claim property, and although over 60% of those claims were rejected, that still means over 500,000 homes were issued an eviction notice, throwing out entire families who had been living there for decades. Now, you may be listening to this and think to yourself, how could a country go and treat its brother like that? How could they throw thousands of people to the street, sell off entire factories for a single mark, shut down successful companies, and fire thousands of workers? Well, because despite East Germany recognizing West Germany as a separate country, West Germany never recognized East Germany as a country. East Germany was always considered as a foreign occupation, and East Germans who supported or benefited from the East German government and its policies were traitors who supported this foreign ideology that had taken land that had rightfully belonged to the Federal Republic. Polls taken right after unification revealed that a mere 11% of West Germans were welcoming towards East Germans in their new unified Germany, and that only 1 in 5 West Germans considered themselves to be one people. Another interesting point to mention is how the Federal Republic treated Nazis and former East Germans, despite one of those being a choice and one of those being where you were born. For example, we already talked about the thorough cleansing and political vetting that former East German civil servants, teachers, journalists, etc. had to go through. But after the end of World War II, a much more watered-down version of this occurred to supporters of Nazi Germany. And even after that, the 1951 amnesty law passed down by Konrad Adenauer's government reinstated 90% of the people who were even fired in the first place. And that includes judges who handed down the death sentence to communists, Jews, and Romani people. In regards to the military, the Federal Republic has no problem paying out war pensions to Nazi soldiers, including those who willingly served in the SS, and giving officers who served under Hitler a military burial. But officers who served in the GDR's military are not buried with military honors, and receive pensions much lower than what an average graduate student gets as a stipend, not to mention the pension of a Bundeswehr soldier. The pensions for people who worked in some form with the GDR government was also massively reduced, including those who were victims of Nazi persecution. A story that I can bring up is that of a lecturer from East Germany who had his pension frozen. Upon investigating, however, it was discovered that he had actually served as a civil servant under Göring. Realizing their mistake, the Federal Republic immediately unfroze the man's pensions and raised them from 1,200 marks a month to 4,900 marks a month. In Germany, Nazis are considered to be bad, and you learn about the horrors they committed. But at the end of the day, they were still people that fought for their fatherland, and serving the fatherland is held in a higher regard than anything out of East Germany because East German was foreign in nature. Stigma against East Germans still continues to this day. The CEO of Axel Springer, Germany's largest media organization, had some of his emails leaked in which he claimed, "Easterners are either communists or fascists, and nothing in between. Disgusting." One has to wonder how prevalent this type of attitude is in German newspapers based on how the CEO speaks, not to mention the mass layoffs of East German journalists and perspectives. But this sort of attitude doesn't need to really be leaked, as German politicians themselves openly talk about it. In an interview, when asked about why East Germans vote far-right, CDU politician Marco Wanderwitz stated, "Even after 30 years, they have not yet arrived at democracy." The West German attitude of the uneducated and culturally inferior East has still not left German society. And now we arrive back to this map which I showed you in the beginning. Why does East Germany vote far-right? One has to consider life in East Germany in the past 30 years. Since one of the largest economic depressions in modern history, East Germans still make up the most of the unemployed in Germany, and they have less disposable income. More East Germans, almost half, feel like their children will be worse off than their parents were. In addition, a majority of East Germans felt like their life was better in the GDR, although instead of investigating this fact, the German mainstream shares the story under the headline, "Homesick for Dictatorship." And I want to use this article here to illustrate how East Germans are spoken about in mainstream news sources. Now, this article comes from Der Spiegel, a very mainstream German news source, which, like most other mainstream German news sources, was founded by a Nazi who later became a successful German politician. The article starts by interviewing an East German man for his perspective and makes sure to include that the man did not feel comfortable using his real name because, and I quote, did not want to be associated with East Germany, which he sees as a label with negative connotations. Continuing with the interview, the man said, "People who live on the poverty line also lack the freedom to travel," clearly referring to the fact that although people were restricted from traveling in the GDR, people who are poor today, although they have the freedom to do so, cannot afford to do so anyway. To this remark, the journalist writes, "In Berger's opinion, there is no fundamental difference between dictatorship and freedom." The article continues condescendingly, "Berger is by no means an uneducated young man." Throughout this article, the man interviewed feels like he has to step down and continue to put down the GDR as if having to justify his feelings about his life. And by the end of the interview, the writer of this article casts him as an apologist for East German dictatorship. Because of how the German mainstream, which is disproportionately controlled by former West Germans, talks about East Germans, they are also alienated from mainstream society and politics. Even the former Chancellor Angela Merkel, held up as an example that even Ossis can reach a position of power, was a member of the right-wing CDU party that campaigned and engineered the plundering of East Germany. Former East Germans know that they are getting a bad deal, and their poverty is rubbed in their face. When the Federal Republic of Germany helped the United States in its illegal war on Afghanistan, newspapers published stories targeting East Germans with headlines such as "Unemployed or Afghanistan." Following the US textbook for military recruitment, the German Bundeswehr offers financial incentives to those who join, half of which are East German, despite only being about 20% of the population. Now, when people are poor, feel alienated, feel like they are being taken advantage of, and don't have hope for the future, they start to look for answers. What effect do you think it has on this population that virtually every teacher, journalist, politician, and researcher with any hint of left-wing sympathies was purged from a position of influence? What effect do you think it has when schools teach about the wonders of the free market and capitalism and constantly put down anything that questions the way it functions? With people searching for answers to their problems, any hint of leftist thought decimated from East German social life, and nothing but insults and ridicule from German mainstream liberals, it creates a population that is in such a perfect situation for right-wing radicalization that one has to wonder if it was intentionally crafted to be so. And the German far right knows this. You can tell it from their name, they are literally marketing themselves as an alternative for Germany. Now, if you're a worker who's completely unsatisfied with the current political system and you hear about a party that is supposedly an alternative, then you're more likely to think, hey, let's check out what these people have to say. And unlike the SPD and other mainstream liberal parties, the AfD is saying exactly what they're already thinking. Your concerns are valid, the current political system is garbage, and we will do something about it. And through this message, they can feed in their answers of migrants and communists or whatever as the blame. Now, to be clear to any East German AfD supporters who are watching, your concerns are valid and the current political system is garbage, but the AfD is just doubling down on the direction that Germany has been going for the last 20 years and is feeding reactionary answers to real problems. You can check out this video here by another YouTuber, Bestie Marx, who makes a very good breakdown of the AfD's Nazi and capitalist ideals. But the AfD's lies about being a real alternative are easy to see as well. For example, towns affected in the German state of Brandenburg just voted against the expansion of the Tesla Gigafactory on the basis that the expansion of this factory would require much more water to keep up with the increased production. which is a very valid concern considering that Brandenburg has been suffering from water shortages for a long time. But of course, the polling of public opinion was ignored and the expansion was approved. And not only this, but the state gave the richest man on the planet a €1 billion subsidy to build it. Now, the AfD has no problem vocally coming out against this, and of the mainstream liberal German parties, they are actually the only one to do so. So people living in Brandenburg will think, hey, these guys actually listen to us. But no, here's Alice Weidel, the face of the AfD, hanging out with Elon Musk, the head of Tesla, and they're getting along quite well. And Elon Musk strongly supports the AfD, the only party that is vocally against the expansion of his Tesla factory. If the AfD really cared, he would be the guy to talk to. But no, here they are laughing together and having a good time. The last point I want to mention should be a simple no-brainer for the German mainstream, but is, I assume, intentionally ignored so they can keep peddling their East Germans are too culturally inferior to understand democracy rubbish. That being, who actually votes for the far right? Well, in the East, the highest number of people who voted for the AfD were under the age of 30. And if we do a little math, we can find out that these were people born in the Federal Republic of Germany, not the GDR. I said it earlier, but I'll say it again. During the unification, or annexation, or whatever you want to call it, East Germany was intentionally taken advantage of and plundered by West Germans. A higher rate of poverty, a higher rate of unemployment, a strong sense of being excluded from society, no real hope for their future. These are the things that drove people to look for answers to their problems, because the German mainstream had no problem selling off their industry to make money, calling them culturally inferior, and ignoring public opinion polls on how their states should be governed. In their search, they could have found one of two answers. Is it a surprise that after every vaguely left-wing teacher, politician, public figure, journalist, radio station, and sympathy was wiped from public life, and that kids are taught in school how socialism always fails and that the free market is the only way to guarantee their freedoms, that the people of East Germany arrive to the conclusion that the far right, which like always markets itself as an alternative, has found support in the young population that has never known another way. I hope this video doesn't come off like I'm defending the AfD or other AfD voters, because I'm not. But I hope that by watching this video, people can change their thinking towards far-right voters. Because we can talk all we want about how the AfD is a Nazi party, but the truth is, they don't care. You can't convince people not to vote for the bad outcast party when their entire society casts them as the bad outcast people. When talking to far-right voters, instead of focusing on how the AfD is a racist party, we should focus on destroying its core message, because they know it's a racist party, and we know it's a racist party. We should focus on the point that this is not an alternative, and whether the SPD or the CDU or the Greens want to admit it or not, the AfD's vision for Germany is much closer to what they support than to a version of Germany that actually addresses the core problems of unemployment, mass migration, poverty, and social alienation. Thank you for watching, and thank you to my patrons that support my work. I've been meaning to do a video about East Germany, and with the recent elections, I knew that people would be pointing the finger at the East once again, so I figured that this would be the perfect time. My mom was East German, and my grandparents spent the majority of their childhood and working lives in East Germany, so the topic is something personal. I even briefly lived with them in the famous commie blocks you always hear about. I was unfortunately educated in history in the United States, which means that I was not really educated at all, and I remember one day when I came home from school when I was probably like 10 or 11, and my mom asked me what I learned that day, and I responded with something like, I learned that under communism, everybody starved and was homeless and was depressed and all that nonsense. And she looked at me and she said, you know that I grew up in a communist country, right? And none of that is true. And it kind of broke my brain there for a moment. But I learned to never take anything an American history teacher says too seriously, so thank you for that, Mom. Anyway, if you like what I do, you can support me with a one-time donation at Buy Me a Coffee, or join my Patreon and get some sneak peeks and some other things. I'm still figuring out how this platform works and what I should do with it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.